when I came from an outfit called Rocky Mountain Institute, which is an energy efficiency consulting firm and think tank in Colorado. And when I first got to Yahoo, the co-founders wanted to start a sustainability program. They sort of gave me a blank sheet of paper and said, figure out what this means for Yahoo. And very quickly, it became clear that it meant partnering with our data centers, because 75% of Yahoo's footprint, carbon footprint, is from data centers. So when I first got there, Casey being a notable exception, for most of the data center guys, I was that hippie over there. I was that hippie who was going to make them do all sorts of green stuff that they either didn't understand or was going to be kind of a pain in the neck for them. And a couple things have happened over the last 4 years. Data centers are increasingly in the news as we as an industry consume more electricity, as branded companies like Yahoo and Google and Facebook build their own data centers. It really, we've moved from sort of backroom plumbers and operators to really center stage and with a lot more scrutiny. At the same time, we're getting a lot more recognition about these data centers and the energy efficiency that they have. The guys that I have the pleasure to work with at Yahoo take a lot of pride in their data center design. They hate to see waste. They like to optimize. They like to see continuous improvement. And 2 years ago, we got recognized for that by the Department of Energy. They had a Green IT grant. They gave us a $10 million Green IT grant in recognition of the work we're doing up in Lockport, New York, which I'll talk about a little bit. And we started making the association between building good data centers and doing good, saving money, the other kind of green, the sustainability. And I gradually went, this was a measure of progress for me that's hard to translate into a metric. I went from being that hippie to their hippie. I'm still a hippie as far as they're concerned, but I'm their hippie. And in terms of embracing and having a sense of sustainability being part of a core principle of how we run our data centers, that's been really heartening and gratifying to see. There's one coworker of mine who about once every other week or so, I pass him in the hallway and he says, "Hey, are we green yet?" And that's actually an excellent question. That's what I'm going to try to hit on. Are we green yet? Are we green yet as a company? Are we green yet as an industry in terms of things like PUE, cooling efficiency? Are we green in terms of metrics? Are we green in terms of the cloud? Is virtualization making us greener? And these are all questions that we continuously ask ourselves. You know, where are we headed? What kind of a journey are we on? And how will we know when we get there? And here's a concept that I want to loop around to a couple of times. There's a designer named Bill McDonough. He's a green architect. And he wrote a book called Cradle to Cradle several years ago. And the concept that he put forward is this idea of designing for more good instead of less bad. In my line of work, we talk a lot about reducing carbon footprint, reducing waste, cutting emissions by 50%. And that's really important, and that's something that takes us along the road to sustainability, but it shouldn't be regarded as an endpoint because it still falls into the less bad category. Bill McDonough talks about, when he says more good, it's designing in ways that people may consider to be kind of outrageous. Can you design a car that actually takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is a goal that Toyota has stated as an aspiration? Can you design packaging that when you dispose of it, it actually adds nutrients to the soil? Can you design buildings that are regenerative and improve the health of the occupants? Along those lines of things. Because when we talk about reducing our carbon footprint, that's a good thing. That's something we should all aspire to. It's an important part of the journey. But we're still stepping on things when we do that. It's still a process of making things less bad. And there should be an underlying aspiration of more good. And this gets back to sort of high school level calculus. When you look at a lot of the metrics in both data centers and electricity consumption for data centers and for global warming, they're talking about the second derivative. You've got a position of something. Velocity is the first derivative. It's how fast things are going. Acceleration is the second derivative. And you're talking about the upward trend in the growth of data center energy usage has slowed. That's a second derivative. From 2000 to 2005, data center electricity use doubled. and the prediction it was going to quadruple between now and 2020 or so. Jonathan Kumi of Lawrence Berkeley Labs issued a report just recently saying, hey, actually, from 2005 to 2010, we only increased 36%. We're still increasing. I think all of us are happy as an industry to see data centers increase. We want to see the growth in data centers. None of us are terribly happy to see an increase in utility bills. That's something we want to see go down from a strict money-saving perspective. And we certainly, from my perspective and what my job is, I want to see greenhouse gas emissions go down rather drastically. But what we're seeing right now is just a slowing in growth. We're still growing. We're still growing our electricity consumption. We're still growing our greenhouse gas emissions. And if you're listening to what the climate scientists are saying, we need to be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And we're not even headed in that direction. This is what Paul Hawken calls walking south on a northbound train. If you look here, we have the 2050 target. We have the rate we're going at right now. We have a 2020 target that the state of California set, which we're probably not going to actually meet. And that right there, that rectangle, indicates where scientists think we need to keep our CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That is the bathtub that we're filling every year. Imagine our CO2 emissions every year as being a tap that's flowing into a bathtub. Because we produce more emissions than the planet can absorb every single year, we're filling that bathtub up. It says that the bathtub needs to be between 350 to 450 parts per million for us to avoid really catastrophic levels of change in the temperature. So when you talk about growing less quickly rather than cutting our emissions, you're not necessarily hitting things in the right direction. And there's some good research, a great group called Climate Interactive, if you're interested in getting into this in more detail, that tracks this in real time. They're taking advantage of some of that big data we're seeing out there. They go to the climate negotiation years, and on a laptop, in real time, they get the information about what each country is agreeing to and put it into their equation and say, yep, we're still not actually meeting our goals. If you add all these together, this is what you get at. And so getting back to the acceleration versus velocity thing, when you talk about reducing our growth, slowing our growth in carbon emissions, it's kind of like falling out of the 40th story of a building. Let's say you hit terminal velocity and you're not accelerating anymore. Is that a good thing? You're still falling. And that's something, when you're looking at the less good, the less bad, more good paradigm, that's something to keep in mind. We want to continue to see growth in data centers. There's a lot of good that can be done with data centers. We'll talk about that in the more good side of things. But paying attention to what's happening to those derivatives and where we actually really need to get to. If you're talking about are we green yet, that's an important thing to keep in mind. So what are the more good opportunities for data centers? We'll talk about those down the line. A lot of what I still do is focused on that energy efficiency, is focused on the less bad, because it's incredibly important. There's some great victories to be had there, and it's something we're very good at. It actually functions very well for a lot of chief financial officers as sort of a gateway drug, because you can still, there's still so much low-hanging fruit out there in the way of PUE, in the way of reducing your utility bills, that pays for itself very, very quickly. So that's why energy efficiency is going to remain important for a very long period of time. This is the latest step on our journey. This is the Lockport Data Center. It's in western New York. And this is known as the Yahoo compute design. You can see it's sort of shaped like an industrial chicken coop. You've got the cupolas on top. How many people have seen this before? Okay, fair number. We talk about this a lot, so I don't want to overstate it. But this is a chillerless design. We use free cooling about 99% of the year. We have an evaporative cooling system where we spray mist through a medium that's made of cellulose on the sides of the building. And we open up the louvers on the side of the building and on that little cupola on top. 99% of the year, that's all the cooling we need. We love the weather up in Lockport, New York. They don't hear that very often. Because the ambient temperature out there allows us to do this design, which results in 40% reduction in electricity consumption. Because it's not a water-cooled design, it's 99% less water consumed, which is becoming an increasing concern. Green Grid's been measuring WUE, water usage efficiency, for a while. That's going to be a next big trend that we need to pay attention to. Because these are pre-engineered metal buildings without raised floors, it took us about 6 months to build them, a lot faster than conventional time. They're modular data centers, each about 1.5 megawatts. And you can add things when you need them, sort of a modular effect. So faster, lower cost, more efficient. Sub 1.1 right now, we're about 80% capacity right now. We're continuing to build. We've been there up and running for a little bit over a year now. So that's our data center there. What's interesting there is it's kind of in the process of getting rid of the chillers, sort of making that leap and saying, okay, we're getting rid of the chillers, we're sizing a much smaller cooling system that we only use some of the time. It's a little bit like moving from this to this. Still getting the same or better performance and reliability, but eliminating a lot of the mechanical systems that we're used to relying upon, which is great. We have some very good sailors on the data center team, and some kind of interesting problems you run into, like in the wintertime, that warm air coming out of the louvers up top, this little cupola on top, producing a lot of icicles, so needing to keep that into our operational equation, very important. This is a result from our first summer. Part of what we're doing with the Department of Energy is reporting very carefully on this because they're very curious to see how the data center is doing. So the performance data is something that we're tracking and reporting out to them. We have the third warmest July in 141 years of data, warmest single month in 56 years. Lots and lots of very warm conditions that push the envelope of the data center. We continued to have extremely good reliability there and discovered where we needed to be trimming the sails. One thing you need to pay very close attention to is things like relative humidity. So you pay attention to what's happening in weather coming down the pike and get ready to adjust the data center accordingly. If you're going to have a dew point of 80 degrees, you need to let the data center go up to about 86 degrees so you don't get condensation on the servers. This is something where if you just by brute force turn on your chillers and ramp them up a little bit, you don't necessarily need to accommodate for. A couple of other things that we're working on right now that are interesting are adjusting fan speed that brings the air in. Instead of running a single fan at 100%, running two of them at 50%. So we're hitting the sweet spot in terms of the optimization of the efficiency of them. It doesn't necessarily have directly to do with free cooling, but it's something that we're seeing very important changes in energy efficiency as a result of that. Another one that's kind of interesting is the general trend in data centers is definitely letting things get hotter. We're realizing that servers have a greater level of tolerance. In the wintertime, we're actually experimenting with letting the data center get even more cold. We're opening the louvers even more. And the reason that we're doing that is because that cooling is completely free, because it's not a mechanical load that we consume electricity to deliver. We can see what effect that has on the individual servers. We've got partnership with folks at the University of Georgia, and one of their hypotheses is if you find the sweet spot with a given server, you've got the server fans, all servers not created equal. If you find the sweet spot of the exact right temperature for that server, you can reduce the energy load by about 30%, is their theory. Because our cooling is free, we have the freedom to experiment with extremely cold temperatures in the middle of the wintertime and see what that does to our servers. One of the interesting consequences of that is that when we do that, our PUE actually goes up. Think about that. Because our mechanical load stays the same, it's free cooling, we're not paying any more electricity to cool something, but our IT load is actually reducing because the servers, the fans in the servers are having to run less hard. So temporarily speaking, it looks like our PUE goes down. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about holistic approach to metrics. We're trying to get to a lower PUE, right? Yeah, we've got a very low PUE. Let's start paying attention to our IT load. When we pay attention to our IT load, what's that going to do to our PUE numbers? So keeping track of the entire system and trimming our sails in the process is something we're paying close attention to. So just talked about this. What's next up for us? As Casey was talking about, you're getting to really low levels of PUE, so what about the 1 part of the PUE? If you're getting to 1.1 or lower, what about on the other side of the decimal point? What about that IT load can you affect? Well, and what can you affect beyond just cooling? And one of the things we're looking at is questions of redundancy, questions of backup servers, questions of gensets, all that sort of stuff. Do we really need to run every single data center to tier 4? That's a question we've been asking ourselves for a while. We've got everything from batch processing, large compute jobs that we're doing behind the scenes, that it's okay if they're not 100% 9 nines worth of reliability. On the other end of things are things like Yahoo front page or fantasy football, which is very important that we keep it up and running and have a high degree of reliability. So across the vast number of different Yahoo properties, people get very angry if fantasy sports goes down. This is not something we take lightly at all. So we've got a wide variety of properties, a wide variety of tasks, and what we're asking ourselves is, does everything need to be tier 4? Or in some cases, are you cutting butter with a chainsaw by providing a tier 4 level of reliability? It's expensive to cut butter with a chainsaw. It's unnecessary. It's kind of messy, so avoid doing that. This is something that we're noodling with for our next generation of data centers, is saying, okay, let's feed off the utility, let's rely on the utility. We've got these individual modular data centers, which are great and easy to build because we've got the Yahoo Compute Cube. Let's build them even smaller. Let's build them in 200 kW increments. And instead of each one having tier 4 level of reliability, backup systems, each of them having a diesel generator associated with them, let's feed the utility power and diesel generators through a power ring, which provides greater levels of redundancy where we need it, like tier 4 in the middle there, and very little redundancy where we don't need it. So in the event of a grid failure of some sort, you get, so we're going, this is utility power coming in, 1030 kW the top there. In the event of a grid failure, some of the systems that are being supported are tier 1 or tier 4 or tier 2, and the tier 0 on either end, that's batch processing that can either go somewhere else to another data center, or it can wait. And there's an opportunity for a huge amount of savings there by matching the job with the level of reliability that you need, both in terms of CapEx, building generators, and also consumption of electricity and backup servers. This is actually from a study that Microsoft did, and what they're really talking about here is utilization of servers and a relative savings that are affordable. Down here at the bottom, you've got PUE. Certain amount of savings, but we're really cranking down that number. Drastic amounts of savings to be had from server utilization. So between the idea of backup generators and tier levels of reliability and reducing waste there and utilization, going back to the sailing metaphor for a second, it's a little bit like, imagine you've got your sailboat and you've got a crew of 20 on it. And 10 of those guys, each of them have one task that they're assigned to do. One operating system, one task they're assigned to do, and they're doing it about 3 or 4 hours out of the day. Average industry server utilization is supposedly around 8%, 10%, even lower in some cases. So they're only working 4 hours a day. Each of them has one task. And you've got the other 10 guys who are on standby in case any one of the first 10 guys were to drop dead suddenly so they can leap into their place. What we're trying to do through a combination of virtualization and really examining our reliability needs is to see where's the redundancy in that system. In some cases, you're absolutely positively going to need those 20 crew members, but what can we do to reduce waste in terms of our IT load? How do we make our crew smaller and more efficient? So we've been experimenting with virtualization. Again, we've got a bunch of different things that we do, a bunch of different tasks at Yahoo. What we're looking to do in virtualization is to match different operating systems within different servers to boost the total utilization of those servers over time. So if you have a task that's CPU heavy but disk input-output light, you match it with a CPU light, disk I/O heavy job. So our engineers are hard at work figuring out how do we match different operating systems and stack them on one another in individual servers, across different servers. How do we increase our flexibility to improve that, get each of our crew members to be working a little bit harder on more tasks, more hours out of the day. This brings us to the question of, is the cloud overall green? And I can talk a little bit about our cloud. We've got about 680 million registered users. 200 petabytes of data, that's increasing, 100 billion events a day, and on and on. We're a global company, so we have a cloud. We have a private cloud that we use to enable all those things to occur. And there's a certain amount of switching around in between, an ability to be flexible because we have so much variation in demand. So this is something that we're proud of and continuously looking to improve. Our ability to dispatch from one place to another is something we're continuously working on. It's not perfect right now, but it's something that we see as being a huge opportunity for savings, a way to reduce the number of servers we need to deliver our 680 million users, and also reduce the amount of electricity consumed. So it's important to us in terms of getting a level of elasticity. When Michael Jackson died, there was a huge spike. When Osama bin Laden was assassinated, huge spike in terms of traffic. And we were able to handle that because of our cloud, but it's something we continuously work on in terms of improving our elasticity. That's important both to our service and to the amount of electricity we consume. We also have something we're calling utilitization. And what this is thanks to the cloud, thanks to our ability to look across our different data centers and provide services to individual products in the cloud, as opposed to a single box owned by a single property and used just for that task, is we're able to really track what's the cost of delivering something. What is the cost in terms of server capacity of fantasy sports versus mail versus everything else? That's pretty important to us in terms of saying, okay, how are you doing in terms of ad revenue versus the number of servers that you are consuming? This makes us not only a greener company in terms of our electricity consumption, it also makes us a more efficient company in terms of revenue to cost, and really paying attention to those. Remarkably, that's something that's been difficult to track. Historically, you get a box, you use a box, a variety of levels, and that's been something that now we're tracking better. We're able to do the bookkeeping on how much you're actually using that capacity a little bit better. So why is cloud green? This is an interesting question. John Koomey over at Lawrence Berkeley Lab has been talking about this a bunch. Is something green just because you put it in the cloud? If you take all of your services, all the things that you do internally of IT right now, and you put it on the cloud, are you automatically more green? You outsource that. You get rid of all of your servers and hand it over to someone else. His argument is that with a public cloud, if you're doing that, if you're making that shift, cloud will be more green. You'll reduce your overall electricity consumption because of the following things. Number one, you get economies of scale. If you're running your data center and it's not your core competency, odds are good that farming it out to someone who that's all that they do, they're going to have a better PUE, they're going to run things more efficiently, they'll give you a greater level of reliability. It's something that, in part because that's their core competency, in part because the scale they're dealing with, they're going to get greater levels of efficiency. That's a fair argument. Diversity and aggregation of loads from a variety of users. That's what we're doing right now. We have enough diversity within Yahoo products. If you think of all of our products as being a bunch of different users, that we're able to get an aggregation of things and stack things up. You can have each of those crew members doing a couple of different tasks because there are a couple of different tasks to be done. So you get better server utilization. You get flexibility of servers. Because you're able to move load and move jobs around, getting back to that tier question, you may need less backup. You can get a higher level of reliability without, for every single box, having a backup box, for every single crew member having another one just standing there trying to look busy just in case the original crew member drops dead. So flexibility of servers, greater reliability with less backup. And then there's also a problem that really, Yahoo doesn't have, a lot of companies that are offering a public cloud don't have, which is because data center is part of our core business, there's not a split between IT and facilities you see in a lot of places. Historically, and Uptime Institute talks about this a lot, there's a split between IT and facilities, and in some cases one group is paying for the purchase of the hardware, the other group is paying for the utility bills. So merging those together, making sure that everybody's paying attention to the same things is important in terms of efficiency. You can end that split by farming it out. So those are all things that are assumed to be part of the cloud. If you have a cloud service, do all of those things absolutely apply, especially as demand for the cloud increases over time? Not necessarily. You may, in many cases, get, what it says at the bottom is, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. I think it's very important as cloud increases and as the demand for cloud increases, as people step into the space of offering cloud services, it's important for us to make sure that all of those previous points are in fact true and keeping track of them. The other thing to keep track of is where is your power coming from? This is something that we've been focusing on. As demand for the cloud increases, as more data centers are built, there's a natural tendency to try to find where power is cheapest. In many cases, that's going to be where the power is not so clean. 40% of electricity right now comes from coal in this country. We've been trying to be very careful about where we site our data centers, looking for places to site them that are clean. But if you're looking for the best possible deal, it's entirely possible you're going to wind up somewhere where the carbon intensity of your electricity is a lot higher than it currently is. So let's say you shift all of your services out to somebody else. They're getting up and running really quickly. They don't necessarily have great utilization. Power is cheap, so they're sort of paying attention to their cooling load, but not really. And it's an area with a high level of carbon intensity. You may not be moving to a cleaner option. It's something that needs to be very important. It's probably true, but we need to be more explicit about step 2 here when we're talking about the cloud. It's not a silver bullet in terms of solutions. A couple of things to think about there. Increasingly, we're paying attention to where our cloud is served from. There are privacy issues in different countries, so it's not enough to say, okay, we put it on the cloud, we're done. Depending on what you're having as your services, you may or may not want your data center cloud to be in Switzerland. You're still on the hook for the privacy laws in the individual countries. So people are getting very savvy now about where their clouds are. If they put things in the public cloud, they're still on the hook for those particular constraints. And as we get more savvy about where our clouds are, then hopefully we'll also get more savvy about thinking about the carbon footprint of those individual clouds' locations. Cloud aside, just siting of data centers, because it's being done more and more by branded companies like Facebook and like Yahoo and like Google, you're seeing more attention paid by nonprofits like Greenpeace. Greenpeace published a study last year called How Dirty Is Your Data Center? And they paid very close attention to where the power is coming from. In Prineville, Oregon, Greenpeace was targeting Facebook and started a campaign called Unfriend Coal. This wasn't something that was front and center back when we weren't consuming so much electricity and when it was mostly colos. Colos aren't things that consumers can latch onto. They don't usually have a great deal of visibility. As data centers consume more electricity, as branded companies that consumers can recognize start playing in this arena, then you're going to see a lot more consumer attention paid to where these data centers are sited and what sort of electricity they're consuming, both for individual data centers, individual companies, and for the cloud. Something that they're starting to do in Europe as well is outsourcing as a way to avoid green tape. There are requirements put onto data centers for reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the many advantages to shifting over to the cloud is somebody else is going to deal with this green tape. Somebody else is going to deal with this. But then the onus is on them. They have the responsibility to make sure that they're engaging in best practices as well. And this brings us to the question of, are we green yet on metrics? Many, many metrics around there. We made a huge amount of progress in terms of observation of metrics over the last even 5 or 6 years or so. There's a lead standard for data centers now. There's an Energy Star standard for data centers. Bunch of different ones. ASHRAE has been adapting to the changing needs of data centers. And the question is, are we looking at these holistically, and are these pushing us in the right direction? Simply benchmarking and knowing what you're measuring is a step in the right direction. Knowing how much electricity a server consumes and being able to compare the performance of one server against another is a huge amount of progress. So that's something we could think we're making good progress in terms of that. At the same time, the movement is kind of slow. Things are changing so rapidly in this industry that the standards don't necessarily always keep up with the progress that the data centers are making. This is Scott Noteboom, my colleague who was at Yahoo, who's now at Apple, was noodling around with this a little bit. Talked about where did the 45 to 55% humidity recommendation from ASHRAE originally come from. Originally, for a long time, the standard has been to keep the humidity of your data center in a really tight envelope. And that's not necessarily necessary anymore. There's a wide range of condensation levels, wide range of humidity levels that you can subject a server to. Microsoft actually put a bunch of their servers out into a tent that they bought from Costco and just let it sort of rain in. And last time I heard, those were still running just fine. So where did the standard come from? Scott maintains, based on some research he did in looking at old manuals, is the standard for that humidity level came from back when we were using paper punch cards. And of course, what happens to a punch card when it gets too humid? It gets soggy, it sticks inside. So I haven't been able to completely verify this, but the problem there is if you have a standard that was set for one technology and the technology is changing very, very rapidly, it's important periodically to rigorously review those standards, ask where they come from, and ask whether they need to be changed. And as Mark Monroe and GreenGrid can attest to, that can be a very painful process, changing standards, getting to agreement about those standards. But it is important to keep track of them, keep track of the whole picture. One thing I talk about a lot is the progress that you're seeing in data centers is a reflection, and the rapid progress is a reflection of the fact that we've got huge changes in the technology inside the data centers happening. We're seeing amazing progress in green buildings for human beings. We haven't changed our constraints at what we need in terms of temperature levels in a couple of thousand years, several thousand years. Servers are changing every 18 months or so. So shouldn't we expect data centers to change much more rapidly than our buildings are? And standards also need to adapt, and we need to keep a critical eye on what's happening with them. So that was about 15, 20 minutes on less bad, on the energy efficiency side of things. What about the more good side of things? More good to less bad. I think there's actually not too much happening on the more good front yet, but you're starting to see things happen. And some of it is about the other 98% of electricity and what's happening in that realm. What's the impact that the internet and data centers are having on the rest of society? The folks at Intel talk a lot about the other 98%. Data centers, ICT, they're consuming 2 or 3% of electricity globally. What about the other 97, 98%? And there was a study about 4 years ago done by an outfit called the Climate Group. It's called Climate Smart 2020. And they went ahead and projected out to 2020 and said, okay, let's make some assumptions about what's going to happen with ICT, and what's going to happen to the rest of the carbon footprint. So in 2002, you got about 0.5 gigatons of CO2 being created by electricity consumption in the telecom and the internet combined globally. They said, okay, if we keep going in this direction, by 2020, we're going to be producing 1.4 gigatons, almost triple. At the same time, ICT enables things like the smart grid. It helps us to make our electricity grid more efficient and more reliable through real-time dispatching better information. We're going to see the rise in smart buildings, buildings that can adapt and cool much more efficiently because of real-time data coming in, sensors, things like that. And we're also going to see an increase in video conferencing, people going places virtually rather than getting on a plane and traveling somewhere. My former boss, Amory Levins, called this sending your electrons someplace and leaving the heavy nuclei behind. So a greater level of efficiency there. And by the climate group's calculations, in 2020, ICT's industry is going to be responsible for reducing 7.8 gigatons worth of CO2 between smart buildings, smart grid, video conferencing. So you've got the 1.4 gigatons and 7.8 gigatons of abatement. So a more good being leveraged by that less bad energy efficiency, electricity consumption up there. So there are a lot of assumptions in there. It's a good study. It's a little outdated at this point. We made some progress in some areas, less progress in others. Less progress on the abatements, but we're getting more efficient in terms of ICT. It's an interesting notion. What can we as an industry do to affect that other 98%? Beyond just the physical side of things, we're already starting to see some interesting things going on. This is a company that GigaOhm refers to as the Facebook of energy savings. And basically what this is you are able to log on, get your utility data, your electricity consumption in real time, and compare it to your friends, and get into a little competition. They did a pilot project, I believe it was in Texas, and the winner, she won a free car. She reduced her electricity consumption by about 25% over the course of a month. It gets into some pretty extreme behavior that you wouldn't necessarily want to maintain over time, like not running your dryer, et cetera. But what this does is allow people to compete against each other and take advantage of peer pressure, take advantage of the kind of information you have, where you're able to calculate both your savings and how you're doing versus your friends. This would not have been possible even 5 years ago. What does it require? It requires real-time data from your utility, really good conversation back and forth between you and your utility. It requires almost entirely ubiquitous access to the internet, because what you want to do is addict people to playing this game and to competing with their friends. And it requires a level of reliable information from your utility on a regular basis as well. So all things that are enabled nowadays by the rise of big data, by ubiquitous computing. One of the things the federal government's working on right now is called the green button. Has anybody heard of the blue button? The blue button is something that's already in common practice. You can, as a US citizen, get pretty much all of your health data downloaded to you in raw form. It's online through a variety of hospitals and healthcare organizations, and bring it to your doctor. What they want to set up now, and they've got a pilot project going with a couple of utilities in Southern California, is access to your utility data. So Simple Energy has a couple of good partners. The idea is to make this something that's available to all of us. So you know about your electricity consumption, have access to that data, not just in a paper bill, but just by pressing a button online. And the impact that that'll have on our behavior, and the impact that'll have on companies like Simple Energy being able to get us to compete against our friends, is potentially pretty huge in terms of energy reductions from residential use. This one I'm the most excited about right now. There are actually at least 2 projects going on in terms of partnering solar and wind, intermittent power sources, with data centers. Now, there are a lot of 100% renewable powered data centers out there, and there's some that are actually running off of power that they have themselves on-site generation. More commonly what you're seeing is, what they mean is they're buying renewable energy certificates. They're buying the equivalent of offsets against their power. So they are green, they're buying green attributes, but it doesn't mean they necessarily have a 2 megawatt wind farm right next to them that's powering their facility. What a couple of folks are doing is really looking at this problem. The problem with wind is it doesn't blow all the time. The problem with solar is the sun doesn't shine all the time, and it's very expensive to store that electricity using batteries. So what Rutgers University, they have something called Green Slot, and what they are trying to do, they have a little data center pod up on top of their roof. They've got a solar panel associated with it, and they're running batch jobs. They have software that predicts what's going to happen to solar in the future. and they run an algorithm and figure out what their load potential will be, how much electricity that panel will probably be generating in 48 hours from now. And then they have a set of jobs they've provided which that need to get done by a certain time, a certain level of reliability, how long each of those jobs is going to take, computer processing jobs. And they queue those up according to when they're due and how much power they have available. And what they're trying to do there is overcome the problem with intermittent power and just continue to provide the services that are needed when they are needed and use 100% solar energy. And this is important because it enables the use of solar. It reduces things like transmission and distribution. You have your power source right there instead of running through a variety of lines and having conversion that reduces the amount of electricity you actually get. It's an interesting idea. What's even more exciting is some work that they're doing at Clarkson University, where they are dispatching load across geographically distributed pods. And they're just basically moving the jobs around, jumping them from place to place. And the assumption is you're going to have electricity from wind or solar in one of these places. It's called geographic firming. So the idea is you can maintain a really high level of reliability without being tied into the grid, without backup, simply by moving the load around to where the power is. And they're making good progress in this area. They're going to be publishing a report in the next couple of weeks, I believe. And so the idea is you're using intermittent power sources to run data centers. And this could be a game changer for wind and solar. The constraint has always been, well, it doesn't run all the time. It isn't terribly reliable. What if you're able to provide that level of reliability through your network by moving stuff around, by following the sun, and getting power from where it's available, where it's cheapest? Frequently, wind is running in the middle of the night, and it's getting spilled off. It's being wasted, or they have to ramp down the turbines to a less efficient level. What if you're able to move load, move demand to where the power is, and by doing so, get cheaper power, get it more efficiently, and enable the development of renewable energy in a really, really powerful way. And so the question is, where is demand from the industrial internet, from smart grids, smart buildings, that rise in big data going to take us next? So we talk about big data, and I think it could go either way. You know, on one hand, if the big data we need is all real-time data, we need it immediately, then of course we're going to need more reliability. If it's data that involves crunching numbers, involves huge data sets, processing them really quickly, but it can happen whenever, then maybe there's a lesser level of reliability. Maybe the folks at Rutgers have a solution that we can do. You just queue up your job and it gets done within a couple of hours, and that's just fine. So you're able to access that. So I don't know which of these scenarios is actually going to play out. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Last but not least, there's a guy named Bill Gross who he started a couple of companies. He's a serial entrepreneur with a group called Idea Lab. And his theory is that fast, ubiquitous computing to do lots and lots of iterations of models is something that is going to be the cheapest resource in the future. This is something that, because of the rise of data centers, we're going to have lots of access to this. It's going to be much cheaper than pretty much anything else, much cheaper than physical resources in the future. And based on that, the examples he's given are from these three companies which he actually helped to start. Aptera is a car that gets 230 miles per gallon equivalent. It's an electric car. And they built it through optimizing over and over again, running design models on a computer in a way that wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago, 7 years ago. Just over and over again, running this model until you had the optimal car. Same thing with the Stirling engine, which has been a technology that's been around since the 1800s. They managed to optimize, improve by about 40% the Stirling engine just by running iterations, compute iterations over and over and over again. E-Solar is a bunch of solar panels they have out in the desert. They figured out how to disassemble, reassemble them onto a truck, just using basically one single ratchet as efficiently as possible. And they solved that topographical problem by running a bunch of compute cycles. And this seems kind of trivial, but that amount of ability to chug through mathematical and design problems like that in a couple hours, whereas back in the old days, before we had that kind of compute power, it would take us weeks, months, or longer, is pretty powerful. And his argument is the biggest savings we're going to see is by harnessing that kind of compute power in the future. And that kind of brings us full circle back to data centers. What if by enabling the smart grid, part of the idea behind the smart grid is you get a much, much higher level of reliability. Facebook's actually gotten rid of their diesel generators in Sweden because Sweden has one of the highest levels of reliability for their grid of anywhere in the world. So Facebook's made the gamble and said basically, we don't think in this particular location we need backup diesel generators. We think the reliability of the grid itself is sufficient for us, plus our UPSs, that we don't need that. So what if the grid, the smart grid, creates that level of reliability in most places where we have our data centers? So we're able to get the reliability that we need, not from our backup systems, but through the grid, which is enabled by the internet in terms of that greater level of reliability. So in terms of whether we're green yet, I think the answer is no. We haven't reached a level of green. We're still on the path to less bad. We're doing that extremely well. We're making good progress in that area. We're making inroads into the more good. And I think it's possible we're not ever actually going to get there because the challenges are going to keep popping up, new challenges will emerge, and the technology keeps changing. I would certainly hope that my job becomes obsolete within my career lifetime. I would like it if sustainability is integrated into the company. We solve problems around climate change, and my job is done. I will move on to something else. But I think in the near term, I've got a certain amount of job security because this is something that we're going to be continuously going on in terms of a path. So that is it for now.